Welcome to this, the second meeting of the Welfare Reform Committee for 2014. Could everyone please make sure that the mobile phones and other electronic devices are switched off? Having done that, we go to agenda item 1, which is our first item of business, and that's to take decisions on whether to take items 3 and 5 in private. We've already agreed item 4. The members in agreement with that? Yes. Okay. Our second item should be a public petition, PE 1496. Unfortunately, the petitioner has had travel problems this morning. He is on his way, and we do have some items that we can continue with on our agenda, but in order to do that, we now immediately have to go back into private, and we'll open up the meeting to the public again when the petitioner arrives, if members are agreed with that. Okay, in that case, we'll go into private session and take the private items until such times as the petitioner gets to the committee. Okay, thank you. I'll open up the meeting again by returning to our agenda item 2, which is the taking evidence on petition PE 1496 on bedroom tax mitigation. I'd like to welcome Alan Wiley, who is the petitioner, and he's brought along with him Jack Ferguson, the Unite Scotland Community Coordinator. I'd like to invite Alan Wiley to make a brief opening statement, and then we'll open it up for a discussion from members of the committee. Over to you, Alan.
Hi there, thank you. First, I'd like to thank you all and the Scottish Parliament for allowing myself to put forward this possible solution to mitigate the effects of the bedroom tax in Scotland. I found this whole process quite refreshing, so genuinely thank you. My name is Alan Wiley, and I'm the spokesperson for the No to Bedroom Tax campaign. We are a tenant-led campaign which tries to deal with the bedroom tax in a non-party political manner. This is Jack Ferguson. He's a Unite Communities Regional Organiser for Scotland, and he'll be helping me answer a few of your questions. I appreciate that we're here to speak about the petition, but I think if we're speaking about the bedroom tax, it would make sense to very briefly to explore why we're in this place in the first place. The housing system in the UK is in crisis, and it's not me that's saying that. Shelter and CBI state that the crisis is due to a chronic shortage of homes. This is not new, and it didn't happen overnight. In the 1970s, there was a change in mindset in the political class. Rather than the state concentrating on subsidies on the supply side for subsidising the building of affordable homes, there was a move to subsidise the demand side, and this directly resulted in fewer affordable homes being built. We've had this change of mindset, plus housing policies which actually took housing stock out of the social sector. It was a recipe for disaster, and this is the cause of our housing crisis. This brings us back to the bedroom tax. People who are against this policy call it the bedroom tax, and its supporters call it the removal of the spare room subsidy. It's not a tax, not in the truest sense of the word, and it's certainly not a removal of a spare room subsidy. That isn't credible. There's never been a spare room subsidy in the first place. I think it's best if we refer to the actual legislation, and when we do so, we find that this policy already has a name. It's called the Under-Occupancy Penalty. This policy penalises tenants who are on benefits. Now, this, to me, is the nub of the situation. It's not political, it's ethical, it's morals, it's what's right and what's wrong, and this is wrong. I don't want to live in a society where the poorest are forced to pay, literally pay, for politicians' mistakes. I think that's unfair, and to be honest, we've not got that lot of money. So where are we now? The Government in Westminster claims that this policy is needed and it's beneficial to the wider housing system and wider society. They claim that it's fair and it saves money. I hope I've already explained why this policy isn't fair, and if you don't mind, I'll very briefly explain why it doesn't save money. Very simply, all this policy does is devolve the cost to Westminster to a lower level. The money that Westminster argued would be saved is still to be paid, but the difference is it's not to be paid for your housing benefit, it's to be paid for your DHP and increased rents, while social registered landlords face increased costs. There are no savings, that it's a mere sleight of hand. In fact, evidence by Costler reveals that the bedroom tax will cost £58 to £60 million in Scotland this year. So what can we do? We can't repeal the policy, not here anyway, so we need to mitigate the effects of the policy. Our petition puts forward the argument that the Scottish Government should fund the bedroom tax shortfall. This temporary funding measure would ultimately protect tenants from eviction and debt, and it would protect the income streams of social registered landlords. We don't specify a mechanism to distribute these funds, although we do accept that DHP funding is at its maximum level. There could be a mechanism whereby this temporary funding measure could be distributed as a supplement to social registered landlords' revenue. This would instantly negate the massive problems that we are having in getting people to apply for DHP. Scottish Government figures show that 105,000 Scottish households are affected by the bedroom tax, but yet in November, only just over 45,000 households had received a DHP payment. This leaves 60,000 households who have received no support. To me, this shows that something is wrong. The system isn't working, including myself. It's failing to ensure that tenants are aware of the help and support that's available. So having this temporary funding measure as a supplement to social registered landlords' incomes would mean that local authorities and housing associations have the responsibility and onus of administrating and distributing these funds, rather than tenants who are scared and confused. What I'm trying to say to you is I believe that there are more mechanisms available now that DHP is at its highest level. Even with DHP at its maximum level, it doesn't cover the full bedroom tax shortfall. And due to this, we've seen inconsistencies in how different local authorities are dealing with DHP applications. We have two households in the exact same situations, staying in different local authorities. One will receive help, one won't. I've spoke to various local authorities, and the message I'm hearing is that councils need to make hard choices. But it would seem that, sadly, it's the disabled people who are hardest hit by these hard choices. The Department of Work and Pension advised states, in respect of discretionary housing payment, that a local authority would not generally say that a person is able to use disregarded income, such as disability living allowance, to pay their rent. But some councils are doing this, and it's resulting in disabled people being refused help. This policy by local authorities has been challenged in the courts in England. The lawyers in the case in the West Midlands claim that this policy breaches the Equalities Act and Human Rights Act. This petition stops that. It will negate and nullify all the effects of bedroom tax in our communities. This funding measure will protect tenants. It will also protect housing associations, guaranteeing that they can continue with their excellent work within the community. And it will protect local authorities and the essential services that they provide. But I also think this petition has political and symbolic value. One of the beauties of living in a digital age is being able to contact and stay in contact with tenants that are directly affected by a bedroom tax. Since last April, we've been in constant communication with tenants from all over the UK and in Scotland. And in the summer, we asked them what they wanted us to do. They told us in no uncertain terms that we were to support all measures to mitigate the bedroom tax. We were to support all efforts to repeal the policy, and we were to push this petition as far as possible. Although this petition is in my name, it doesn't belong to me. It belongs to tenants in Scotland who've asked for help and been told no, and I'm here on behalf of them asking for Scottish Parliament for help. If this Parliament does not have the powers to do this, then I genuinely apologise for wasting your time. I genuinely apologise. But if it does, then I believe that we, as a society, and this Parliament as figurehead of that society, that we should stand up and protect tenants from unworkable and outright nasty politics. The bedroom tax has been rejected by the SNP, it's been rejected by Labour, it's been rejected by Lib Dems at Scottish level and federal level, it's been rejected by the trade union movement, it's been rejected by Civic Scotland. By agreeing to this petition, you're unequivocally saying that this Parliament rejects the notion that the poor should have to pay for the mistakes of others. If you're pro-independence, then accepting this petition shows what a pro-independent Scotland should look like. If you're pro-union, it shows that devolution works. Everyone is a winner. Tenants win, communities win, housing associations win, political parties win. We all win. Everybody wins, except the Tories, and they deserve to lose. Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Alan. I'll open it up to members of the committee to ask questions. I have an indication from Jamie first. Anyone else?
Thank you, Commissioner. Thank you, Mr Wiley, for your evidence thus far. It's clear you're a very passionate advocate for your position. As you and we are all aware, the UK government introduced the bedroom tax, but you're here in the position of asking the Scottish Government to provide the solution. So I'm just wondering if you could set out how your campaign's engaged with the Westminster, Parliament of Westminster Government, the way you're engaging with us today.
The campaign has got quite a few different aspects of it, but specifically in the Westminster, we've been doing online campaigns, online petitions, online, and trying to get together that way. I was down as part of a delegate from the No to Bedroom Tax campaign when the bedroom tax was being debated at the House of Commons, so we've been putting pressure on that way. We've been lobbying MPs from all political parties, trying to put pressure on them. We've been lobbying on a lower level, Lib Dem councillors and representatives, and try to get them to put pressure upwards, because we believe that Lib Dems are the weakest link. We believe they're the weakest link, and we believe you can get to them. But that takes time. That takes time. Sooner or later, the people of this country, we will end the bedroom tax. That will happen, no ifs, buts or maybes. But we're here to ask this Parliament for help. We've been quite protective about this petition. We don't want to be party political in any way whatsoever. It's not an attack on the SNP. It's not an attack on this Parliament. We view the SNP and the Scottish Government, Scottish Labour, as our friends, our allies. We're just asking for a wee bit more help.
Okay, I get that, but you're clear in terms of the measure you're asking the Scottish Government to bring forward. Can you, and I'm presuming the bottom line is, like most of us in this committee, you would ask the UK Government to abolish the bedroom tax, but failing that, what would you be asking the UK Government to do? I mean, you've got a clear request for this Parliament, but what would be the request of the UK Government?
Repeal the bedroom tax.
But other than that, in terms of mitigation,
I mean, I think the point here is that we're asking the Parliament for what the Parliament has the power to do. I mean, we absolutely need the bedroom tax to be abolished, and the focus of any campaigning towards Westminster would be pressure for abolition, because there really isn't much point in mitigating something that is, a complete and utter failure, which has led to a massive increase in rent arrears and caused misery across the whole of the UK. So there's no question it must be abolished. However, in the meantime, there's urgent financial issues being faced by tenants immediately that have been over the last year, and now day by day, who are losing money. And that's really the point of being here at the Parliament, is to say, protect people short of the abolition, which is what we're also full-on campaigning for from Westminster.
There's no other request of the UK Government, for example, to leverage in more money by way of discretionary housing payment?
Well, I think it's not, rather than mitigating it, we want them to abolish it.
Well, indeed, we're all agreed on that, but that's the only request that you have of the UK Government, is to abolish it. But the other request for the Scottish Government is to find funds to mitigate, which you have yourself just said has its limitations.
Yeah, but the point is that this policy is a disaster, and so if there was the power here to abolish it, then we'd be here asking you to abolish it. At the level it can be abolished, that is really the only sensible demand of them. Like, some kind of steps along the way are really too short. They're not what's required. What's required at a UK level is abolition. And there's really no point in asking them to kind of improve on something that's failed. What we're here doing is asking for emergency help, short of the longer-term objective, which is getting the UK Government to move on this.
Where would either of you suggest, Mr Wiley, where would you suggest the Scottish Government finds the money from?
Let me take a photo. That took a lot of time somewhere. I think that's what governments do. Governments do every day. I can't view the accounts. I've not got an army of accountants to look over details. But that's what governments do every day of the week. They decide a policy, then they fund it, and then they go for it. That's it. I do accept that with financial mitigation, that there's an argument they rob Peter to pay Paul. But my argument is that I trust that the Scottish Government would broach this subject in a common sense matter, and if they did find the money, that they would make sure that it wouldn't come out of any other budgets, or if it did come out of any other budgets, it would have little or no ramification.
I think the key point that Alan made is that this money needs to be found from somewhere. It was money that we recognised on a state level, at a UK level, that people in poverty can't afford to pay. The UK Government has reneged on that responsibility and walked away from the responsibility of protecting the poorest and most vulnerable in society. That doesn't negate the fact that the rent money can't be wished away. The landlords need that funding, and the current position is, if we leave things as they are, that we're expecting the shortfall in funding to be made up by tenants. That's what the bedroom tax amounts to, is the government is going to withdraw from its funding it requires to provide for housing, and it's going to put the cost onto some of the poorest people in society. And I think the point for us is that there are going to be massive long-term ongoing costs from that. Like, it saves money in the long term to say, right, we just recognise now what is a fact of life, which is some people are too poor to be able to meet the full cost of their rent. We go back to the status quo as it was pre-bedroom tax, and we help those people to meet the shortfall in their rent. And that will, you know, the short-term cost of that will be mitigated in the long-term cost of rent arrears, administration, people moving home, everything that comes with the disruption that's happened due to the bedroom tax.
Obviously, the government would have to find that money in the first place. So do you have a suggestion where it could come from, Mr Ferguson?
I don't have a suggestion for where particularly you should take the funding from. My point is that we need housing to be fully funded, and we need tenants to be protected. And the Parliament needs to take a decision here to make it a political priority. I mean, I think this is one of the most important decisions the Parliament's probably had to take in its history, in that this is exactly why people wanted a Scottish Parliament. They knew that down the line we would have Conservative governments that would take extreme measures that people would want some protection from. And that's what we're facing now. We're facing social chaos being caused by this policy. And so we appreciate, you know, that this puts the government in a difficult position, but the point we're saying is this is a level of emergency that you need to find a priority for this to assist tenants with paying their rent.
Kevin.
Thank you, Convener. And Mr Ferguson just talked about extreme measures put in place by the Tories. This is not the first time that that's happened. And he talked about the formation of a Scottish Parliament to protect people from the worst excesses of Tory government in Westminster. Can I ask you, in terms of the powers over welfare as a whole, do you think that those powers should lie fully here or with Westminster? Mr Ferguson first, please.
For myself, I mean, I wouldn't want to take an official position on behalf of the union and whatever. I mean, as you're probably aware, the trade unions and STUC, they are neutral with regards to the referendum and the whole debate that's going on just now. I mean,
I'm not asking about
for welfare power. I mean, I think I'm hopeful that we're going to have some success with yourselves as the committee today, and I think the Parliament better represents the views of people in Scotland on these issues than clearly we're seeing from the Westminster government at the moment. Yes.
I agree. I think it's quite. There needs to be housing benefit. It would make sense if housing benefit was under control of the housing department. You know, I think that if housing benefit was in housing department, it makes you got a fuller understanding of the expenditure and of the workings. It would make sense. There does seem to be genuine confusion about the powers that this Parliament has in regard of making this money available. I've spoken to people from all sides of the political divide, and depending on which side that they are, it's either this Parliament can do it or can't do it. I believe that Danny Alexander's take, this Parliament had the power to do so, and the Scottish Minister, David Mundell, on the 13th of January, said that the Scottish Government has the power to completely deal with it now. The Scottish Government has the power to completely deal with it now for remarkable little, if there is such a priority. So I believe that there is the powers. I believe that there is the powers to do so.
We have seen mitigation in other areas where the Scottish Government have stepped in to stop the excesses. Council tax reduction, for example. And yet, here in this Parliament, at the former Sub-Ledge Committee, which names escapes me at this moment in time, Delegated Powers Committee, we seen some members vote against that because they thought it was ultra-virus. And, you know, there are still folks out there who say that, you know, we do not have this power. The Housing Act states that the maximum DHP that can be given is 2.5 times the amount of money that Westminster gave for DHP. What do you have to say to that?
Accept that the DHP is at its highest level. But we believe there's other mechanisms that can be used to distribute and administer this money. As I said earlier, well, you could have a supplement to it could come as a supplement to social registered landlords' income streams, and that would mean that the money would go straight to the landlord, and the landlord would be in charge of administrating it. There'd be no onus on the tenant, and that would negate the poor take-up of DHP. There's another alternative that's been put forward in a private member's bill. Is a creation of a prevention of homelessness fund. It's another mechanism that could be used. I just believe that we might need to think outside the box. We can't. DHP is at its highest. We accept that, but we are here, and we also accept that there's a lot of other mitigation that's gone on beforehand. But this is so serious. It's such an emergency. That's why we've come back and saying that we really need this help. We really need the final bit of help.
As Alan said as well, with the issue with the DHPs is that there's a lot of confusion out there amongst tenants over what they're entitled to. There's also people who may have applied for DHPs much earlier, you know, before the additional funding was put in place, been refused, and they think that's then been refused. So, I mean, there's already been too much onus, I think, put on the tenant through this whole process for them to sort it out, for them to engage with the bureaucracy, to fill out the forms. I mean, I don't know if people are aware of the exemption that was discovered by tenants and then spread virally on the internet, where they found out that people who had been in their home before 1996 were actually exempt from the bedroom tax, and that was in the regulations, but the government had still been deducting money from those people, and it took tenants themselves finding that in the regulations and then spreading it online between themselves to get all those people the money that they actually were entitled to under the regulations of the bedroom tax. So my point in making that is, you know, tenants have already contributed a lot towards the process of trying to work these things out. There's clearly still problems with people in massive rent arrears. So while at the same time Alan's saying, you know, we're going to need to look outside the box, the other thing is that we want to try and take some of the onus off on tenants, that they have to go and apply and ask for extra money all the time, because that's clearly causing people problems. People have all kinds of different levels of engagement and ability to engage with that kind of process, and it would be much easier if we could find a way to kind of circumvent that.
Well, hats off to those folks who have made efforts in trying to get rid of this iniquitous policy, is what I would say. Today, the Scottish Parliament, Scottish Government's Housing and Welfare Minister is in Westminster. Would you ask Westminster to listen to her over these issues? Would you back her calls for the abolition of this tax? And do you think that the possibility of changing the DHP Westminster policy would make dealing with this, mitigating this, a little easier?
If it wasn't, yeah. But we found that the contact we've had with the people in this Parliament has been quite two-way and quite open, quite a democratic feel about it. The contact I've had with Westminster has been pretty much one way. I contact them and they ignore me. so at least I'm not alone. At least I'm not alone.
He's used to that, and the fact that Westminster ministers have refused to come and speak to us in a public setting.
There needs to be, specifically the bedroom tax, there needs to be something done. There needs to be some sort of action that protects tenants. Because we're in a situation, it's just, there's some stories and some people out there that really, really, really need help, and they've been told no. And that's why we are reiterating that they've been told no and they need that help.
It definitely, I mean, I would, with regard to your question, like it deserves acknowledgement that the government has, the government at a Scottish level has lobbied the government at the UK level against the policy, and you know we We absolutely applaud everyone that's made efforts against the bedroom tax, and I think it's worth re-emphasising again, our experience of dealing with the Parliament here has been very positive. We feel there's many people here that understand the issues at stake here. The problem we've got is that the government at Westminster is really, it's determined to pursue it in the face of evidence and common sense and, you know, everything that has been presented which shows the immense social harms that's resulting from it.
Linda.
I didn't expect to come in so quickly. I thought I would be joining the queue. Welcome. Alan, can I say to you that I think probably in your introductory statement there was nothing that I didn't agree with, both in terms of, you know, the sort of historical aspect to social housing and where it's gone. But there was something you said that made me think. You said, I think towards the end, that if this was carried through, everybody wins. I'd like to put it to you that in a situation where there is a fixed grant that comes to Scotland via the Scottish Government, that if you look already what has been done about, you know, mitigation of some of the welfare reforms, not just the bedroom tax fund, the extra funding that was given, you look at the Scottish Welfare Fund generally and the social fund, and you know, the Scottish Government having to use more and more of that fixed grant to mitigate the excesses of Westminster. And then you recognise that there are cuts in the budgets coming over the next couple of years, which can't be denied. The evidence is there. That if you say that this is going to need 50 million every year, that's 50 million that genuinely has to come from somewhere else. So not everybody wins, because those people who don't get funding for whatever, because we're having to mitigate something that's coming from London, are not winners.
Well, I recognise and acknowledge that the mitigation that's been it's a hell of a lot of money that's been already funded. We're here because it's desperate measures. You know, we know what we're asking, but we know that we've asked for something and we're asking again. But we're only asking because it really is so desperate. I've got a friend. It probably explains the bedroom tax in this one wee story. I've got a friend. Her name, actually, I won't tell you her name. She used to be in the army, and she was a veteran, and she fought for this country. But due to some of the stuff that she saw, she found it really hard to readjust to civilian life. That's nothing to be embarrassed of. It happens to the best of us. It happened to me when I left the army. Now, although my friend's quality of life was good, the system the state provided to maintain her welfare, it worked. The system, it did work. It provided her with a safety net, but also a launch pad to a secure and happy life. Everything was fine for her until a few years ago. She was one of the thousands that were found fit for work by ATOS, only to be found, only for that decision appealed. But it took her 9 months. In that 9 months, the strain was too much. But she got over that. A family got together and they all got over it. And then came the bedroom tax. My friend had stayed in that house for over 20 years. It was a family house. Her children had moved out. In April, she initially started paying for it. She applied for DHP, but was refused. And that happened till September. And she got to the stage where she had a choice of paying her rent or feeding herself or feeding her family. And she decided not to pay her rent. Because she never paid her rent and there are other stresses involved, and because she's not in the best of situations, she had to be hospitalised, and the strain split up her family. In December, she found out that she should have been exempt from the bedroom tax. So all that was for nothing. The split up the family was for nothing. The bedroom tax is about rent and about houses, but it's about families. It's about real people who are in such a horrible and sad situation. And it's not through their fault. It's the fault of a senseless and mindless, short-sighted policy that is causing more trouble than it's worth. It's costing more money, and it's hurting people really, really bad. And I do appreciate and I do acknowledge the money that's been mitigated for other aspects of the welfare reform. It's just that bedroom tax is affecting some of the most vulnerable and the most people that really need help, and they're not getting any help.
No, not yet. Thank you, John. again, I agree with what you're saying, Alan, you know, but I'm trying to look at the practicalities. And there's another practicality here. You spoke in your opening statement about, you know, how the onus on housing changed. And I think you were obliquely referring to the right to buy and the rise of the private sector, whether it be owner-occupied or whether it be private rented sector. Well, you know, the area that I represent was hugely affected by the right to buy of social rented housing. And as a result, there's a big private rented sector. And more people these days are relying on the private rented sector. Now, it was some time, years before this government, not long before this government, that policies were changed that meant people in the private rented sector wouldn't get housing benefit to cover all the rent if the house was deemed to be bigger than their needs. It wasn't the bedroom tax per se, but it was actually very similar, imposed on people in the private rented sector. Now, I've got people in my constituency saying, you know, everybody's trying to help council tenants who are affected by the bedroom tax. Nobody bothered their shirt about us, and, you know, who's fighting for us? I know there's a fundamental difference in ethics, I would say, between social rented housing, which I wish we had more of, and the private rented sector in terms of ownership, etc. But there is also an issue of people in private rented sector housing who find it very, very difficult. And I wonder what you would you know, say to these people in terms of what the intention would be to help them.
I think that the intention must be some sort of campaign that housing benefit is paid on by the need of the tenant and not some arbitrary central decision. The local housing allowance, I don't like that policy. I don't like it. But there were some significant differences in how that was implemented in the bedroom tax. LHA, it was trialled over 8 periods for a couple of years, and then another 8 periods for a couple of years. It was independently researched by University of Sheffield, I think. When it did get implemented, it was not retrospective. It was only for new claims only. Whereas the bedroom tax, there's no impact statement. There's not any real impact statement. It was retrospective. It affected everybody. So for LHA, I don't like LHA. I've been hammered with it myself. But it was different implementation. And the implementation of the bedroom tax is harsh. It's removing somebody's safety net, and there's nothing there. Whereas LHA, which I do disagree with, at least it was incremental. But I'm not defending, again, I'm not defending.
The answer for private tenants is that we must cap rents, and we must stop private landlords being able to fleece the taxpayer through housing benefit. That would be the answer I would give to a private tenant, is that the problem is not with tenants, the problem is with landlords, and that you say more and more people are reliant on the private sector. It's out of necessity. It's out of necessity through the long-term changes that have took place in housing. I mean, the one thing I would say, you know, we recognise this is an emergency measure, right? We recognise the limits to its long-term sustainability. When I say it's an emergency measure, it has to go alongside. We need a change at a government level, by whatever means of whatever party, that we get a position where we have a government that's going to be willing to abolish the bedroom tax in the next few years. Like, if it looks like this is going to be the policy in perpetuity and the bedroom tax is not going away, then we recognise the Parliament will have to look at the sustainability of the funding here. But what I would say is we realise, you know, the Parliament, the government's position of they have a fixed amount of funding that they have to make difficult choices with. But the point, I would flip it the other way and say, look at it from the other perspective. As Alan said, that money is still needed. Like, if it's not funded by the Parliament, the funding that is required through the level of rents is still needed by the housing providers. And if we can't provide it here, if we can't provide it at Westminster, all that's left is tenants have to provide it, and tenants can't afford it. And that is clear from everywhere you look at the bedroom tax, the immediate massive ballooning of rent arrears. It's just a fact. People don't have that money, but the money has to come from somewhere. So that's why we're here appealing for an emergency measure to get the funding to save social housing. We don't have any pretense that you could do this for 10, 20 years. we will be, alongside it, we'll be putting every effort into governmental level challenging the bedroom tax, campaigning for its abolition. And we're pretty confident, in fact, that that's something that will be winnable in the next few years with whatever kind of change of government. But in the meantime, we have an emergency situation, and it's just a fact that the funding isn't there. It's not going to come from tenants. So if it doesn't come through additional funding this way, then there's just going to be a shortfall. That's all there is to it.
Just in finishing, Convener, well, at the time that the petition was put in, the call was for 50 million. Since the time, I think, Alan, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think since you initially did your petition, there has been mitigation in terms of extra funding given by the Scottish Government. So I just wonder if you have done a calculation of what emergency funding would be needed this year and next year.
I think it's the additional. I need to be honest here. I'm not an expert, and I'm quite wary of saying stuff. I'm not an expert. I'm not an expert of the detailed housing system. I think we need to be wary because the £20 million it wasn't ring fenced for specifically the bedroom tax. The intention for this petition was to protect tenants. I appreciate. I know that our friends at the SFHA have got research that shows it may cost more. The intention from my point of view, because I represent tenants, is that we want to protect tenants and protect tenants' rents, and that's why it's a 53 million. So, but the actual detailed.
No, that's fine. I understand that. Don't worry about that. That's fine.
There was something that Mr Wiley said in his opening remarks that I wanted to go back to because I think it's interesting and it will help the committee longer term. You suggested that there was a wide variation between local authorities and how they were coping with mitigation measures, particularly dealing with the money that's available under the discretionary housing payment system. Now, we've done a bit of work on that already, and we've discovered that some of the variation is perhaps a misunderstanding in that we're comparing the performance of local authorities at different times. Perhaps more recent information from one local authority that includes the additional money that's been sent, comparing that with the performance of a different local authority at a time before that money was available. So it's easy for us to misunderstand. I want to go back specifically to that and ask you if your information is contemporary and whether you are in a position to give us examples of best and worst practice in local authorities when it comes to dealing with DHP money.
Would I be able to return that and write that in writing? But I've not got it with me. I wouldn't like to say something that I'm not 100% sure of. The big thing that I've noticed is it's using disability living allowance is accounting that as income, and so it's basically it's means test. You've got to means test yourself. It's another struggle for tenants, and especially if tenants have been refused the first time. But I will get back to committee about the differences in local authorities. It's mostly about the thing that I was aiming for is because 79% of those affected by the bedroom tax have got a disabled person in that household. That means 79% will have to be in receipt of DLA, and that means 79% have got an obstacle to overcome to get DHP payment, if that makes sense.
Certainly we're in a position where any information would be useful because we know there are differences in practice and we know there are differences in performance, and one of our priorities needs to be to make sure that best practice is adopted universally. If we could get that information, that more or less covers my point.
If you could set that to us.
That's fine.
Ken.
Thank you, Convener. And can I just say thank you very much for your presentation. I have to say it's hugely powerful and persuasive evidence you've presented already. And you've laid out the case not just emotively on behalf of tenants, but I think very clearly that you want the Westminster Government to abolish this tax because they have the power to do so. But in the absence of that, you want to use the Scottish Parliament, the Scottish Government, to use every power it has to mitigate the whole of this tax, if possible. And it's a very clear ask, I believe. You recognise that the Scottish Government has already gone halfway. It's found the money from its own budget, and it's gone part of the way to doing this, but you want it to go the whole way. The question that my colleague Linda Fabiani asked you already was the one I wanted to ask, was that, I know, and which is that the government has found some money, the DHP has found some money to mitigate. I think, Mr Ferguson, you've actually said you would like this, not just for the money to be found, but for it to be found in such a way so that tenants aren't faced with the burden of and the complexity of having to chase this individually. That's the desired route. In the absence of that just at the moment, and the budget that we're in the middle of budget negotiations right now, do you think the government should find an additional £30 million or an additional £17 million, or what sum? I mean, I'm sorry to pin you down slightly like this, but what sum do you believe would be helpful at the moment in at least sending out a strong message about the Scottish Government's intention?
It's hard. It's hard to say, and the reason why it's hard to say is because you don't want to say something that comes back and it bites in your bum a few weeks later. It's because the 20 million isn't ring-fenced, and because it's not ring-fenced, I'm just wary of putting a number on it. What I would say is that I believe you're speaking to other people after me, and those guys are the experts, and they guys will have a better understanding of the different mechanisms that may or may not be used. Sorry for laying it on them, but I'm a tenant and I represent tenants. I like to think I know a lot about the housing system, but I'm not an expert. And I just don't want to risk saying something just now, that, especially with that money not being ring-fenced, to put a specific valuation on it. I do think it's symbolic value of the Scottish Government doing this. I think this sends, if it was done, it would send a message to Westminster and the rest of the UK and the rest of people that's affected by it in England and Wales, that Scotland says no, and we're taking a stand, and that would give strength to the UK-wide campaign.
I mean, I think the key issue here is assessing how much has been achieved by the additional funding that's been put in already, which we're not in a position to give you all the facts and figures and fully assess on now. But in Alan's presentation, he made reference to the amount of people who haven't been reached yet by discretionary housing payments. I think that would help provide a basis of calculating, you know, what is the remaining shortfall. I mean, the overall figure that we've presented is basically, it's based on the level of rent, isn't it, that's required. So if you were going to say, right, well, first of all, we need to assess the impact that the 20 million's had, I think, as Alan said, you need to find out, you know, how much of that, without it being ring-fenced, how much of it has actually succeeded in the goal of mitigating bedroom tax effects for people, which would maybe take a wee bit of research.
And given that you want to take the burden away from the individual claimants themselves, do you think the best vehicle would be to use the housing associations and local authority as housing providers? Would you trust those as organisations to be the vehicle through which the money could be distributed?
Definitely, yes. Yes, I think that housing associations and local authorities, that's their job. They can do these things far better than people like me. You know, I do think I definitely trust in they're good people.
Can I just ask one further question? We're going to have the panel of experts after you, and we'll ask them this question. The written evidence that was presented is semi-supportive. I was just to ask what your take on it was. Some of them seem to be saying we're not quite wanting to come out and support you because we don't think you've identified enough money. And there's a few questions to be. What do you make of the comments from the expert panel?
We welcome them, but as I say, they're valued stakeholders to the debates, and we're not going to really dispute their expert views. Well, just a wee bit, we're going to dispute them. The first part was saying it's not sustainable, that financial mitigation on this level, and that's an argument that I've came across with before. But my counter argument is doing nothing is even more unsustainable. You're putting the pressures onto the tenant. There was problems with the actual mechanism being used. But as I said earlier, I think the actual detailed mechanism should be decided by experts, by people who are in that trade, in that sector, not by me. I'm just a tenant. I welcome the Scottish Federation of Housing Associations have produced research that says it costs more, and I once again I welcome that. That's good information for us to campaign on. But I represent tenants, you know, and I appreciate that my view is I'm here to protect tenants, and that's why, even though I noticed that they would welcome a fund or welcome some sort of income, but my intention is to protect tenants, housing associations, local authorities. They can stand up for themselves.
I mean, the point for us is, you know, as I say, the figure that Alan has presented is calculated on the basis of the rents. So, I mean, I think we both would favour, you know, a lot more funding to housing providers, definitely, and to social housing generally. However, you know, we've already had the discussion here about the priorities, the amount of money available to the Parliament. Basically, what we're calling for is, as you said, it's a return to the status quo pre-bedroom tax. Here's the amount of rent that is required from tenants as funding into social housing. The people that can't afford it, we recognise that requires to be met by the social safety net. And that, you know, that's the way we brought it forward. Is we think, right, if we're just simply saying just reverse the impact of this particular negative policy, it's quite a clear thing that the government can assess whether it's possible.
Indeed. And just on the question of sustainability, I think, Mr Ferguson, you answered this already. This is an emergency measure you're calling for, in the sense that if we find no way of repealing the bedroom tax, then perhaps we'll have to revisit this. Can I suggest 2 dates? Just ask for your views. The first is clearly the SNP would wish to win the referendum, and then in the result of independence, they would abolish the bedroom tax if successful in an election, and so on. The second would be if the Labour government was elected, we would abolish the bedroom tax. So can I therefore put it to you that the 2 dates would be 2015 and 2016? It could not go beyond that. Yeah, thank you.
I mean, that's what we're working towards here, is that our hope is that one way or another we get a government that will abolish the bedroom tax. If they don't do that, then we have a long-term emergency going on into the future, which we'll have to address then. But this measure is predicated on that basis, yeah.
Thank you. Annabelle.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning, gentlemen. And could I perhaps address my first remarks to Alan Wiley? And I would just like to thank you very much indeed for coming along and commend the action you've taken to promote the issue. And it shows a remarkable sort of dedication to the interests of tenants, and that's really where I think we all should be starting from, which is the issue of tenant hardship. And we should therefore look at the issue from that perspective, and everything that we conclude should be based on what is the best way forward to deal with the issue of tenant hardship. Now, just really picking up on the last couple of points, I was very interested to hear in the discussion of mitigation, the discussion of what is asked for in terms of an emergency measure versus what could be the reality of the situation for tenants in Scotland if a series of scenarios don't happen. And I just wonder, in terms of the issue of sustainability of such measures, which we've discussed at some length this morning, where in a fixed budget this money has to come from somewhere else, so somebody else does lose out, whatever part of the economic picture that is. But in terms of sustainability, is it the case then that you're both advocating, I think Mr Ferguson just mentioned that a minute ago, that this could only be in place up until the year 2016 if a whole series of scenarios don't pan out? Is that what you're both saying in effect? So you're calling for 2 years funding at 50 million a year. It's just really to be very clear on what is being asked for.
I mean,
we're very confident that the bedroom tax won't be here by 2016. We're very, very confident, either by our own campaign against the Westminster government, or by a change of Westminster government, or by a Scottish government. I just don't foresee a situation that will be here. I know I'm not giving you anything hard evidence, but I just the bedroom tax won't be here for long. It's a bad law. It will get repealed. But
I mean, I think it's difficult to predict what the position is going to be. You're describing the nightmare scenario, basically, where this becomes a long-term feature of life in the UK, which, I mean, you know, you guys as the Welfare Reform Committee, I'm sure, hear evidence on all the different aspects of quite how disastrous withdrawing the welfare state from our society is. Quite what we'd do in that situation. I mean, we'd need to campaign for something to help tenants, but we're here making a recognition today that we're not asking the Parliament, as it exists, with its existing funding and its existing powers, to replace completely in perpetuity what was formerly done by Westminster, because, you know, we recognise there's going to be a sustainability issue there. It's not going to be long-term possible. However, the point is that in the meantime, we have an emergency situation, and it's like building up day by day by day. If we come down the line 2 years and we haven't been successful in abolishing the bedroom tax, then, you know, the Parliament will have to look again at what is possible with its funding. And, you know, I'm sure at that time we will be campaigning at every level for support for tenants. However, we're not here, you know, making grand claims that you can just replace what's been taken away with your existing funding. It's just being realistic about it.
Okay, I mean, what I would go on to say is that, of course, with a Westminster government that we in Scotland didn't vote for, and, you know, there's always a fairly substantial chance that will happen again, because it's happened many, many times over the decades, and with other welfare reforms coming down the line that we already know about, and then our report that we commissioned as a committee, the point was made by the researchers that, in fact, the impact of further changes to the welfare system are going to be far greater, which is hard to imagine, but are going to be far greater according to this research. At what point is it that you would accept that the Scottish Parliament, with essentially a fixed budget, is not in a position to mitigate the excesses of a government that we didn't vote for? I mean, surely that is the unsustainable position, and the solution to that is very, very straightforward, which is to vote yes on the 18th of September to ensure that Scotland always gets a government that it votes for, and then we wouldn't have the bedroom tax, and we wouldn't have a lot of this stuff coming down the line that takes away the safety net from our welfare system that the Westminster government appears to be intent to do. And it has to be said that other parties in Westminster have not completely distanced themselves from the direction of travel of the Tory Liberal coalition. And of course, it has to be said that Labour MPs did not turn up in the House of Commons to vote down the bedroom tax when they could have done so, if we remember that pairing arrangements are not supposed to be in place for important matters. Well, it goes to the issue, Convener, of sustainability, which I think is really at the heart of our discussions today. So, in terms of sustainability, at what point does this Parliament have to say this is not sustainable, this whole situation?
That's a choice for you guys. I know, I'm sorry. I was going to say something, but I think it's a political choice. If it wants to be done, you know, if there's a political will for it to be done, then it will be done. I think you should have a wee bit more confidence. I think you should have confidence in your party, and you know, okay, the worst case scenario is that you might get a Tory UKIP coalition in 2015, but you should be confident. You know, the Labour folks should be confident that they're going to win. The SNP folks should be confident that we're going to win. 2016, no more. 2016, there won't be a bedroom tax. Either one way or another.
Mr Ferguson, would you care to comment?
I mean, you know, if you see the position where we, in the next UK general election, we come out with another Conservative government or a Conservative UKIP government, then I wouldn't envy your position here in the Parliament. Like, it's going to be very, very difficult. And if we continue in the direction of travel with the destruction of the welfare state, then we are going to see, you know, really, you know, disastrous social chaos and harm resulting from it, which is going to have massive costs to every aspect of government and everything that the Parliament does. So, I mean, there isn't an easy answer to that. We are engaged as part of a movement to try and defend the welfare state and try and prevent some of the worst excesses of what the UK government is doing. It's an ongoing process. I'd say, as I say, if you come to a position where we're facing another hard right government determined to destroy the welfare state, then the Parliament's going to be in a very difficult position. I recognise that. But the flip side of that is taking this action today and effectively getting rid of the bedroom tax in Scotland sends a very, very powerful message about the intention of the Parliament, about how the Parliament reacts to democratic people's aspirations that they put to it. And I think it would put a serious nail in the coffin of the bedroom tax as a policy and generally strike a blow throughout the whole of the UK in favour of provision through the social safety net.
Thank you, Convener. Can I just say, of course, we wouldn't be getting rid of the bedroom tax. I think we've already established that we don't have the power to get rid of the bedroom tax. What the petitioner is asking us to do today is to consider finding money from somewhere to plug the hole for a period of time, according to the petitioner now 2 years. But that's not getting rid of the tax. That's finding money from a fixed budget from somewhere else to pay for a policy that we don't like, didn't vote in, don't accept. But of course, to avoid the nightmare scenario we're all talking about is a very easy thing that we can do, and that is to vote yes in September of this year.
We're not here to take a position on the referendum.
No, I appreciate that, but you're talking about a nightmare scenario. I'm saying a very easy way to deal with the nightmare scenario is to take the opportunity that people in Scotland have, which is to vote yes, and then we don't have the nightmare scenario.
Well, I mean, all I would say is that we're very much in favour of any form of government that abolishes the bedroom tax. Like that's what we're here to talk about today, is the bedroom tax, and that's what urgently needs to happen. Is that at whatever governmental level, there needs to be a recognition that this is not sustainable and it needs to change. And whether that comes, you know, through whatever party or whatever kind of political change, that's what needs to happen.
We're getting up against the clock now, but there was a couple of questions I wanted to ask just to get some clarification. It has been argued that the part of the problem here about why we haven't had a resolution so far is that the Scottish Government's position is that they are bound by the formula for discretionary housing payments, this 2.5% limit. Okay? Now we can have an argument, a disagreement about whether they could do more outside of that, but just focusing on the increase of 2.5%. Now it's been argued that Westminster could change that situation by increasing the amount that local authorities could spend on discretionary housing payments. So my question is, if by some miracle Ian Duncan-Smith announced this afternoon that he was doubling the amount that discretionary housing payment could be paid at, and it was up to 5 times the amount that the DWP had provided, that money would have to come from somewhere, wouldn't it? That local authorities who currently have to top up the DHP would have to find that additional resource from within their budgets. Or alternatively, the Scottish Government, who have given £20 million in order to maximise the DHP payment as it currently is, would have to find money from somewhere to increase the amount that's available for DHP. So of all these scenarios that we've been given this morning about when the bedroom tax could be abolished or not, any changes, either from Westminster or after a Labour government's elected in 2015 or after an independent government's elected in 2016, if you want to find the additional money to make up what's currently being lost through the bedroom tax, will require additional money to be found from somewhere. Is that not the case?
Sorry, can you...
regardless of the scenarios, if Labour abolished the bedroom tax in 2015, the government would have to find money to make up the difference.
Yeah.
If an independent government in Scotland in 2016 abolished the bedroom tax, an additional amount of money would have to be found to make up the difference. If you're no longer taking the money off people's benefits, then that money has to be kept there, which means that the public purse has to find that money.
I mean, if I understand your question rightly, right, there's basically what the bedroom tax amounts to is a cut to funding of housing. And in fact, what the government has done is quite cleverly diverted the whole debate into being about tenants and about being the rights and wrongs of is this person deserving, is this person disabled enough to deserve a spare room, which is all a massive distraction, when in fact you're right in identifying, you know, the money goes to in theory goes to the tenant, which then pays it through housing benefit. In fact, what you're looking at there is central government funding social housing through the means of paying people's rent. Central government has took away that money. Social housing still needs funded. The money that is required, it still has to come off somewhere. The position that we have is there's been a cut to social housing funding and we expect tenants to make up the shortfall. That's the policy as it stands. So, yes, the cut needs to be reversed. That's basically what we're arguing for. The cut that there's been to social housing funding
So in
needs to
every
be
scenario
reversed.
that's been discussed, it requires more money to be found to get the funding of benefits back to the level that they were before the bedroom tax was introduced.
Yeah, it's a reversal. It's a reversal of the cut.
In terms of this limit of 2.5 times, the Scottish Government have said you can't find the money from anywhere else, so you're restricted to this formula. And we've also heard of postcode lotteries in terms of, you know, who qualifies in what area and may not qualify in another. We've also seen that some local authorities have not topped up to the maximum or hadn't topped up to the maximum until the additional money was found. But there were some local authorities who had created hardship funds over and above DHP level, North Lanarkshire Council being one of them, who'd maximised the amount that they could distribute through DHP and then found £1.1 million for each of the next 2 years to create a hardship fund. That had to come out of their resources, so that means that money had to be found from somewhere and a cut had to be made someplace to find this money. So if a local authority can do it, do you think the Scottish Government could do it?
Do we think the Scottish Government can do it? I mean, evidently we do think the Scottish Government could do it because we're here asking you to do it.
And Danny Alexander told the Finance Committee that it was entirely up to the Scottish Government if they found that money from its own block grant. Do you agree with that?
I mean, we are arguing in the longer term, as all the discussion we've had here about the abolition of bedroom tax, that central government needs to meet these costs. So we don't agree that this is, you know, just to be left to the Parliament to sort out, and that you should be left to pick up the pieces that are left by the chaos that's caused by Westminster policies. Nevertheless, we're in the position that we're in. You know, as Alan said, we struggle to get a response from politicians at a Westminster level. You know, we're here talking to the Parliament because there's an emergency situation for tenants, and that's the situation that we're trying to resolve by speaking to people that we can actually have a dialogue with. Yes, what needs to happen is the policy needs to be reversed. Central government needs to make the acknowledgement that they need to fund social housing.
I think that's us come up against the clock. Can I thank you both for bringing your petition to us today, and we'll consider that as part of our bedroom tax report, which we're looking to take forward. It's been very useful to hear the arguments that you've brought to us. Okay, and I'll suspend the meeting for a few minutes to change witnesses. We now move to our second panel of witnesses, and I'd like to welcome David Bookbinder, who's the Head of Policy and Public Affairs at the Chartered Institute of Housing, David Ogilvie, Policy Manager, Scottish Federation of Housing Associations, and Jim Hayton, who's the Policy Manager for the Association of Local Authority Chief Housing Officers. So thank you very much for coming back in front of us again on this issue, the much heralded panel of experts. So I'll open it up to you if you want to make any introductory comments, even comments on the discussion that took place while you watched our earlier discussion with the petitioners. But I'll pass it over to you, and you can take it in whatever order you might already have agreed. Okay, David,
I think very, very briefly, the first thing to say is to reiterate, as I think all of our organisations would, is to in our case, reiterate CIH Scotland's absolute opposition to the bedroom tax. CIH is a UK-wide body, and across the whole of the UK, we're very clear in our opposition to the imposition of the bedroom tax on tenants. In the sense that the petition seeks to highlight the impact of the bedroom tax on both, in particular on tenants and of course indirectly on social landlords, it's clearly very, very well intended. It's hard to fault the intent behind the petition. As the previous session has shown, the question seems to be over the extent of powers. Well, there's two questions. One, of course, is about are the resources available, and the second is about whether that there are the powers there to meet the petitioners' demands. And I guess that's what we can try and explore in the next few minutes.
Thanks, Chair. I want to make it clear at the start that it's these two who are the experts. Just same as David, sum up very, very briefly local authority chief housing officer's position. We noted that the petition called on £50 million to mitigate all effects of the bedroom tax in Scotland. And I think in looking at it, Alacho was looking at wider than just the DHP element. We see and we hear about the pressures that are put on local authorities because of welfare reform, and the bedroom tax is the first big element of that. And it's not just about trying to make sure that we protect our most vulnerable people from the effects of that. We saw from the study that the Scottish Housing Regulator carried out a couple of months ago, and I know you had the regulator here to speak about it, that the effects for local authorities go wider, and that when they were identifying key challenges, authorities were having to, they said, rewrite their business plans and redefine priorities, take on extra staff and do a whole load of different things to try and mitigate the impact of the bedroom tax. So when invited to decide whether we think additional money towards local authorities is a good idea, you probably won't be surprised to hear that in broad terms we are very much in favour of that. So, you know, local government welcomes or asks for more money from central government, not a great surprise. But we do think we could use that money very wisely if there were any extra money available for good preventative purposes that would indeed go a long way to mitigating the effects of the bedroom tax in all its guises.
And on behalf of the Scottish Federation of Housing Associations, no surprises here, obviously welcome any additional funding that's going to help what is a terrible situation for tenants who have been affected by this iniquitous policy. But also, I think, since we submitted our written response to you, we've also concluded our research, which has been published under the guise of the real cost of the bedroom tax, which highlights that actually we're forecasting or we've projected an £80 million cost to the sector over the coming 3 years. The first year, it's 36.1 million. So in terms of, and bearing in mind, we only make up a proportion of the social housing supply in the country. There's obviously, those figures don't cover local authorities. But COSLA have already intimated, haven't they, publicly, that there is a greater cost implication than the savings that stand to be made by this policy. So in terms of what we're asking for is a long-term sustainable funding solution. Towards the tail end of that previous evidence session, you were talking in terms of covering the next 2 years until the hopeful prospect of a more shall we say, amenable government, either north or south of the border, whichever way there would be an abolition of the bedroom tax. That's something obviously we would support in terms of anything, again, helping to alleviate the situation. But in terms of the other costs, we really want those other costs to be borne in mind, because it's not just about housing associations, it's about all housing association tenants. The longer these costs mount up, the greater the pressure there is in terms of rents going up, and that makes it more likely that more people will be caught in this trap.
Okay, I'll kick off by asking a question. Anecdotally, I've picked up, and we heard in relation to evidence that we received at this committee in respect of the Scottish Welfare Fund, that local authorities in particular are being hit financially because of the additional administration of the bedroom tax and having to mitigate the impact of these changes. One of the arguments for universal benefits is that it reduces administration, that if you get an area or a particular issue and you distribute money on a universal basis, it reduces the amount of administration because you just count the number of people who that applies to and you provide it. Would aid housing associations, local authorities or whoever, if the position we had in Scotland, because we can only deal with the situation in Scotland, if people who are identified as being impacted by the bedroom tax automatically received an upgrade or a reintroduction of the equivalent amount of money, would that reduce the administrative cost of trying to seek those people out, working with them to get DHP or additional support? Would there be an advantage in just identifying those people and making up the difference automatically?
I'll have a go at that. I mean, I think the obvious or the immediate answer to that, Chair, would have to be yes. Local authorities are saying that they are spending an awful amount of time identifying people, trying to engage with people to make sure they get what they are entitled to. But I was at a meeting only on Friday, and one of the, in fact, the authority which seems to be spending the most in terms of DHPs and like the council you mentioned in North Lanarkshire have also introduced their own hardship fund, but they were saying there was I guess a hardcore of people which they thought was maybe about 15% that they were still finding very difficult to reach. So if there were some way that the money could automatically be credited to that person's rent account, I can't help but think that that would have to reduce the costs and the burden and the landlords that are doing it.
Anyone? David, would it make a difference to you?
It's the first time I've heard the idea expressed in those terms, broadly and in agreement with the principle of what you're outlining, because of the simplicity that you've got there. So I don't see any reason why we would have a problem with that.
One of the other issues around providing it in that way is that we know, again, historically, anecdotally, and there probably is some evidence around from academics that people don't like to apply for things. The people who are entitled to housing benefits, various other benefits, don't apply for them because they're reluctant to be seen to go through the means testing process, don't want to be seen to be asking for, in inverted commas, handouts. That would also remove that burden from people. They wouldn't have to seek the support of their local authority to get the support which would be available to them. Is that right?
Yeah, I think in broad terms, we know that means testing does put off people at times. Other people might just lack the wherewithal or the capacity to avail themselves of what's available. And I think it's fair to say, Chair, that different authorities have, again, it's anecdotal, have adopted different approaches to it. But I think fundamentally, DWP rules say that there must be a formal application made and a kind of bureaucratic process to be gone through. So anything that we could do to streamline the admin involved would obviously reduce the costs, and I think local government housing professionals would welcome that. I mean, I should say that within local government, DHPs are much more likely to be a function of the kind of benefits and revenues part of local government and the finance department, but obviously housing managers, housing professionals have a big kind of locus in that as well. So I think they would find that beneficial.
Linda, you want?
Hi, just before I go on to what I was going to ask, can I pick up on that, because I'm a wee bit confused, you know, by the questions and answers there. If we're talking about universal credit, that means that someone just gets the one payment. It's supposed to be all very simple, and then they pay. So wouldn't you have to still seek the people out that may well be hit by bedroom tax?
I'm not sure that was a question, but
my understanding is that the local authorities know who already is affected by the bedroom tax. They know how many people they have spoken to and have had conversations with, and they can identify a number who have yet to respond to letters or had made contact with. So my question was, would it make it easier if the local authority, if the local authority immediately identifies who is impacted by the bedroom tax, then the administrative cost of actually having to engage with those people in order to determine whether they're entitled to DHP or something else would reduce the administrative cost?
I think what I'm saying is that's probably right in the very short term. But, you know, as time moves on, when you're talking about universal credit...
I'm talking specifically about this. I'm talking about universalisation of benefits, the provision of benefits on a universal basis. One of the arguments is it reduces administrative cost.
I get all that, but it's the idea of landlords not having to seek out people who may well be impacted by the bedroom tax.
They already know them.
But that's fluid.
Identified.
You know, that's fluid. You know, further down the line, it's still a case. It's not a major issue. It was just something I was getting confused about the answers on, about how all of a sudden everything would be much easier. Which takes me on to actually the themes that I wanted to talk about. Yes, the short-term cost may well be mitigated. I think it was either Jack or Alan that had talked about that. But you know, when you look at what's been said, you know, about the idea of just, you know, handing over additional money to social landlords, both councils and housing associations, to entirely mitigate the bedroom tax, whether it's an emergency or whether it's ongoing. And I would just like an idea of how landlords would deal with that. You know, the mechanisms, the technical mechanisms of saying, right, we've now got this money, and it's whether it probably, there would be a discussion about whether that should in fact be ring-fenced, whether it shouldn't be ring-fenced. I mean, we've heard some talk this morning of how the 20 million that was given to local authorities wasn't ring-fenced, and there's perhaps a view by some folk here that it should have been. But how would a social landlord actually go about administering money that was given to it by central government to mitigate the effects of the bedroom tax?
I think you've very adeptly highlighted just how complex the situation is. And I think I might need to come back and revisit what I actually said to your original question, to be honest with you. When you look at it in terms of the broad principle, clearly, we and members of the SFHA want to see a long-term resolution to this situation. You know, that's a given. We haven't yet progressed to the point where we've actually got a mechanism designed, or anybody has come to us with a mechanism that is absolutely foolproof. There are some suggestions that there are ways around it by transferring of resources to landlords. However, I have yet to see evidence that would allow us to be in the position to make a definitive statement in favour or against. So I'm not going to go there, to be honest with you, this morning. I just can't. But in broad principle, we have to say we need to be doing whatever we can to identify that. Now, in terms of the mechanism, I've previously said in evidence on behalf of SFHA, and we've just put in writing as well, that in terms of the concept of identifying bedroom tax arrears, it's been done thus far by taking a proxy measurement basically saying which of those tenants who are in arrears today were not in arrears prior to the bedroom tax, and that's broadly how that's been calculated. As you go forward, and yes, okay, the Universal Credit Project is getting pushed further and further back, and you're quite right though, Linda, that once you get into the realms of universal credit, it's going to be far from simple in terms of knowing that. You know, we've got, again, Scottish Government data that's based on proxy data that shows the number of people who are impacted by bedroom tax just now. But as we know, family dynamics mean that those figures are changing all the time. So there's another dimension that we would have to find a way of cost-effectively identifying that from within our housing stock. And that's I don't think we should underestimate the challenge that's involved in that.
I think from a local authority perspective, it would be a wee bit different. I mean, the main impact, I think, of welfare reform and local housing authorities is revenue reductions, either because there's less income coming in from rent arrears or more costs being incurred and putting in specialist teams to deal with it. I mean, one council that I know of is making sure that every tenant who's interviewed about under-occupancy is also getting an interview with another member of staff about employability as one route to try and help them out of that situation. So for local authorities, I think the key issue is the bottom line of what all of this is doing to revenues. So I don't think it would be a huge problem for a local authority to grapple with the problem that said, if you had money to spend on mitigating the impacts of this, what would you do? I think they would very quickly be able to identify ways in which they could make good use of that money, either directly on welfare reform or to offset some of the reductions in expenditure that they may have to be making elsewhere. I won't rehearse the priorities, but we know local authorities have got a quality standard to meet by 2015. We have energy efficiency commitments, homelessness priorities and temporary accommodation problems in some areas. We want to contribute to the health and social care agenda, as well as build some new houses. So all of that is getting affected to the extent that revenues are being reduced. So I would see if we're, and those are indirect impacts of welfare reform and the bedroom tax. So I don't think it would be that difficult for local authorities to say that they could make good use of any additional resources and use them in a preventative way to make sure that services were maintained. First priority, though, Linda, would have to be the bit that this debate is all about protecting the positions of people who otherwise might run the risk of being evicted from their houses because there's a shortfall in their rent payment arising from the bedroom tax. And there isn't a real issue about identifying that group of people who, for whatever reason, figures came out, very helpful figures last week from Scottish Government, and we've still got a bit of way to go to spend the money that we have, and part of the issue there is definitely to identify the kind of hard-to-reach people and say, there's some good news, we can put some money your way to help alleviate that shortfall in your rent.
I think Jim's admirably identified that assistance, if it went to social landlords directly, could take a number of forms. And his example of people receiving employability support is a good one, and it shows the variety of forms of assistance that there might be. I guess the challenge for in terms of sort of constitutional powers, etc., which none of our three bodies would lay a claim to be expert on, is looking quite forensically at the different sorts of supports that can be made available, or the different uses that may be made of monies passed to social landlords, and check, in a sense, do a check that would be a legitimate use of that money. And already social landlords are benefiting from some Scottish Government support on things like advice, through advice support, employability projects, etc. No doubt there is scope for a lot more of that. My sense, or CIH's sense, is that the particular challenge for the lawyers is looking at where some of that money might be passed directly into tenants rent accounts, that has to be looked at by the lawyers to see if that's possible. Because as Jim said, that is where that's the obvious priority of landlords in this situation. The first priority will be to protect tenants who are in arrears.
Amy.
Thank you. I mean, that's quite a useful in for this line of questions to pick up on the area that the convener picked up on. I think we're all agreed about the limitations there are on local government and by extension Scottish Government and this Parliament in terms of funding discretionary housing payments. So it was interesting to hear this suggestion posited that money could be credited against an individual who's been identified as suffering the bedroom tax, essentially make up that individual's shortfall in housing benefit paying their bedroom tax. But I'm just wondering, and I know that David has said that none of the three of you are experts in constitutional law, so I'm sorry for asking the question, but I need to ask the question. I'm just wondering how that interacts with the restriction in the Scotland Act 1998 against this Parliament replicating the social security system.
I confess I wouldn't know the answer to that, and you know, it's a bit like the questions to the previous speakers. I think the first order question is this something that we want to do, and is this something that we think would be A, a priority, and B, have beneficial preventative outcomes? And if the answer to that question is yes, then I would look to people more kind of aware of the processes, more expert in the constitutional processes than I about the mechanism by which we get the money across. Sorry, that's a kind of fudge of the answer.
No, I mean, I'm aware that you may not have a definitive answer, but I mean, clearly there are limitations, and I would have thought that would be one. And if we are starting to get to the stage where we are crediting an individual, then we may fall foul of that particular restriction in Scotland Act 1998. That's one of the difficulties this Parliament has in trying to deal with mitigating something that is not introduced in the first place.
I think another potential difficulty in terms of what I hear from councils is the DWP rules are pretty stringent, I think, about how DHPs should be applied for and granted. And I think one or two councils are trying to be creative about that and make sure that the money goes where it's intended. I'm not sure the extent to which they've been successful so far, but I understood the convener to be asking more of a hypothetical question about if it could be the case that we could just lift and lay the money and say, you don't need to worry about your rent account now because that hole has been plugged. And I guess I was certainly replying in that spirit that would be a good thing if we could find a way to do it. And maybe the DWP could be persuaded because the money's there anyway, they've made the money available. Scottish Government have put in an extra 20 million, and it would be an absolute disaster, in my opinion, if we get to the end of the year and we've got money there that we could have spent on people who need it, but we've been unable to do that because of the difficulties, in some cases real difficulties, of actually making contact with people. Now, councils, I think, will move heaven and earth to make sure that doesn't happen and we don't have a situation where some of the DHP money is unspent. But if we could find a way of just making it automatic, that would be good.
But you do accept the hypothetical could run into difficulties in terms of the reality?
Of course.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, Alex.
Going on to ground already covered here, but I'm trying to keep this simple. And the reason for that is that we in politics often find ourselves in a position where if we say a thing often enough, it begins to be perceived as the truth, even when it's not. Now, I'm looking for a reaction to this, and it's a simple statement, and that is that it is the firmly held opinion of ministers in the Westminster Government that the Scottish Government already possesses all the powers it requires to fully mitigate the impact of the under-occupancy charge. Have you looked at the information that has been published on that, and have you any opinion on that directly?
First, we're currently exploring with solicitors whether there are any avenues that could be pursued, but beyond that, I've only started that process yesterday. So really, I'm not in a position to make any further announcements on that. And that's only because you'd expect it is incumbent on us to look at every possible avenue that can assist our members. So that's one of the things we are currently looking at. I've not looked at the detail of, if I was, to be honest with you, not aware that anything has been published. What we have done is have had some private conversations with some experts. Again, because it's in the development phase, I'm not really willing to put an SFHA position out there on that. But obviously, we're mindful that if there are other avenues, and we need to be looking at them and waking people up to other possibilities, then that's one of those things that we would have to do, and we're currently looking at it.
I mean, I'd be reluctant to give an unqualified answer than that. I think what we're talking about here is really the art of the possible, and within any set of constraints, what the Scottish Government might be able to do and has already done to mitigate the impacts. But the question you ask is a very technical one, and I'd have to leave the answer, I think, to legal experts in that field, unless David's going to demonstrate some knowledge of the position that I'm unaware of.
I mean, it really is very difficult for us to square the two things you've highlighted. On the one hand, the apparent statement from the UK government that Scottish Government does have the powers, and the apparent barriers presented by the what appears to be the limits set upon the Scottish Government by the Scotland Act powers in terms of assistance to individuals for housing purposes. For us who are not, never mind we're not lawyers, we're not constitutional lawyers, these two things are impossible for us to square.
It was perhaps a bit sneaky to ask the question because it's very much a live issue. I'm aware that David Mundell will appear before the Scottish Affairs Committee this week sometime, possibly even today, to answer questions on this specific issue. So we probably will have the option to look at this more closely. In terms of funding, again, keeping the questions fairly simple, in the last panel we talked about where funding should come from if additional funding was required. Do you see this as your key priority, or are there other areas you would prefer available funding to be targeted to?
Can I seek a clarification on that question? Are you talking in terms of the current budget round and discussions?
Well, again, talking in simplistic terms, another one of these assumptions that we make as politicians is that the Scottish budget is a zero-sum process, a fixed budget. And we've heard that statement made repeatedly during the course of the question today. The key thing we have to remember is that the Scottish Parliament, when it was set up in 1999, had, as a result of a vote taken in the referendum, the right to change the basic rate of income tax by up to 3 pence in the pound. So we have the opportunity to consider whether changing the rate of taxation in Scotland is appropriate. In fact, the current Westminster Government have now passed legislation which, post-2016, will allow us to significantly vary income tax over and above that was contained in the original Scotland Act. So we have here a situation where the Scottish Government do have the option, should they wish to come forward with significant spending proposals, to propose changes in taxation that could fund that. So we are not in a zero-sum situation, as has been suggested. So we need to consider whether the use of funds in this area would justify bringing in or exploiting the tax powers we already have.
Again, I think that's definitely one for politicians. I mean, all I would say is that in the last year or so, we in the kind of housing lobby and the housing sector have been delighted that, as for example, Barnet consequentials have become available, the Scottish Government has decided to apportion the lion's share of that, if not all, to new house building, affordable house building programmes, and you won't be surprised to hear all of us say how much we welcome that. I don't know what the prospect of more money from that source is. Here in the news this morning, the economy is now growing by about 2%. And again, one might look to the product of economic growth if it eventually filters through. So I guess there'll be a a range of ways, but absolutely not going to into the realm of advising Alacho says put up tax to fund, not least because my wife might kill me, you know, apart from anything else. That's probably all I should say in that one.
Thanks. Just briefly, actually, because I think Mr. Heaton and Mr. Ogilvie, you made it clear that you do welcome the principle, certainly, of additional funds channelled through housing associations or councils to mitigate this. But, Mr. Bookbinder, just the CAH position seems to be slightly more reticent on that. I'll just ask you, in principle, do you support the idea that the Scottish Government should find money additional to the 20 million it's already found to mitigate the effects of this tax?
I think we would feel more comfortable putting aside, as you say, the constitutional issues in terms of the rights or wrongs of more money. In principle, all the money that social landlords can get to help mitigate the effects of the bedroom tax are welcome. We are, of course, we're in a position at a time of year when we're waiting to see how much and how quickly the existing DHP budget is spent. I think we will all of us have a broader view of what the position is at the end of the financial year when we see the extent, you know, the support that's been provided by the 33 million or whatever it is total that local authorities have at their disposal to spend through DHPs. So we probably have sounded a little more reticent because we don't feel there is a full picture yet of the assistance, you know, of what's happening with current assistance mechanisms.
Slightly more reticent, but you would welcome, just to go back to it, would you welcome some additional finance over and above the 20 million that's already been found?
I think social landlords in Scotland would welcome getting to a position where none of its tenants are suffering as a result of the bedroom tax.
Thanks so much.
Kevin. Thank you, Convener. I want to go back to a point that Mr. Hayton made earlier, and I apologise if I picked you up wrong. But in terms of DHP, you said that the DWP says a form needs to be filled in. Am I right in
yeah, I probably did say that. I was implying that there's a kind of bureaucratic process to be gone through, and that we can't just take the money and put it into the tenant's rent account, for example, without the tenant, you know, having made some kind of application and some kind of assessment having been carried out.
Convener, obviously we've been talking about the restrictions under the Scotland Act, and also there's the Section 70 of the Child Support, Pensions and Social Security Act 2000, which covers DHP. As I've been sitting here becoming a little bit even more perplexed than I normally am on this subject, because if we found another way to mitigate, and we've already had questions from Linda about possible mechanisms, but folk would still have to apply using the form through DHP. It would probably be only after that, if they were refused DHP, that you would look at using any other form of mitigation that you possibly could. So basically, what we would be doing, if I am right in my thinking here, is creating a two-tier system where some folk would qualify through DHP and others through other mitigation measures, which would cause, again, a huge amount of differences and possibly even more stigmatisation than there currently is. So yet another form of divide and rule. Do you think I'm wrong in saying that it would create a two-tier system? You can forget what I've said about the politics of it, but it would be a two-tier system we're talking about if we did find other forms of mitigation, unless there was a change to Section 70 of the Child Support, Pension and Social Security Act 2000. Would I be right in thinking that?
I think in terms of trying to find a way out of this situation, it is certainly far from simple. And that whatever is done now, that we are deep in the bedroom tax hole, is there was always a risk you're going to make the problem far worse, actually. Well, not far worse, but you're going to complicate it in terms of creating anomalies, in terms of who's getting what. The simplest way of dealing with the problem would, of course, be to abolish the bedroom tax, and that's obviously our primary ask. You know, that's what we want to see happen, and that's why probably away from this committee, and you know, if there was to be a discussion with Scottish Government on what mechanisms might be possible, we could probably enter into that. But right here and now, I'm struggling to come up with much more than that, because it really is. We're talking about a scenario that the primary objective here has to be to alleviate the suffering of tenants, and then, but by association with that, the added costs and worry that's being accrued by housing associations and their boards in terms of what their financial position is. So that's where we are at.
Mr. Hayton?
Yeah, I mean, the purpose of the discretionary housing payment is to help tenants in situation of financial hardship in meeting housing costs. And I guess the DWP might say, without some kind of formal assessment, how do you know that that financial hardship exists? But that process does get us into the situation which the chaps earlier were talking about, where, you know, if you're doing some kind of assessment, do you take into account disability benefits, in which case, you know, you're saying, well, you're poor, but you're not quite as poor as this person. And I think, again, back to the point, if we could find a way of streamlining all of that within either within the confines of the current rules, or finding a way, a legal way through these rules, then that would make life so much easier. Otherwise, I think we possibly may already have that two-tier system, if indeed, you know, disability benefits are a factor in the calculation. So anything that removes that, we would be in favour of.
We've probably got a multi-tiered system if we bring other benefits into account. But I want to concentrate on the bedroom tax issue if I possibly can. Mr. Bookbinder, do you have...
I would just add that you're right, very much right, to highlight the inconsistencies that are always going to come with a system that relies on somebody proactively making a claim. And an added complexity that we haven't talked about yet this morning is that as well as the stigma, the genuine difficulty some people have in engaging with that sort of claiming culture, that most local authorities and housing associations, I think, would tell you that there are a minority of tenants who have taken a more of a sort of political stance, if you like, that they oppose the bedroom tax, and that they're not going to, they're neither going to try and find the money, which of course is genuinely difficult for most people, nor are they going to seek to claim a discretionary housing payment. So that's an added level of complexity in a system that relies on that sort of proactive claiming.
Convener, these levels of complexity, bad enough as is, possibly with even more if other ways to mitigate are found. How much does that add in terms of administration costs when you have got all of these different tiers? I know that's a very difficult question to answer, but you know, if you did have all of that, that would be even more in administration costs, I would imagine.
I would put it in these terms. We would have to go back and remodel the work we just published last week. Beyond that, wouldn't be able to comment.
Yeah, it must add, I would think, significantly to costs. And local authorities are already saying that their admin costs are high, not just in directly dealing with it, but in trying to do other things by way of mitigation advice and information and support. Local authorities setting up teams of people to try and help and provide that advice. But there are always, sadly, it seems to be always that kind of significant minority of people with whom it's very difficult to engage, maybe for the reasons that David's described, probably more often just that people blissfully unaware because of maybe the lifestyles that they lead that the help is available, and we really need to try and get to that group and make them aware of the possibility that some help is there.
No, just to add, I mean, the resources that any social landlord focusing at the moment on engaging with tenants, even where tenants are willing, that's still a resource-intensive process. It's probably a law of diminishing returns when you're talking about that minority of tenants, and I'm sure it is a minority who have chosen not to engage. That's where resources, that really tests landlords, because they're not even seeing a sort of quid pro quo, if you like, from the tenants to try and do what they can to mitigate the impact.
So the iniquitous policy, which all of you are against and most of us here are against, and the folk who spoke earlier are against, was put forward by the Westminster Government to try and save money without thinking about the effects in tenants. With all of these added bureaucracies and gaps that we are having to fill, do you think that the bedroom tax has actually saved the public purse any money at all, or do you think it's actually costing the public purse more and at the same time putting folks into real hardship?
We've given evidence, and we've produced evidence over the past year and a half, and even in the run-up to the passage of the bill, which forecast that we anticipated there would be increased cost because of the transfer of tenants from the social rented sector to the more expensive private rented sector. That seems to be happening. We've all got a similar sort of evidence right across the piece in terms of what COSLA provided, exponential cost compared to the saving. Our evidence, again, shows £80 million of additional cost that not a single housing association would have had in their business plans. So that all of that cost is having to be picked up.
And the cost of redoing business plans as you go along. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Mr. Hazen.
We'll know, I think, in a few months' time, at the end of the first full year, what the costs of that have actually been. And I don't think there'll be any doubt that, in policy terms, it will fail a key test in the sense that, being more expensive than the one it replaced for less benefit. I mean, there's an unfortunate side to that, because most people in local government involved with benefits would have agreed and would agree that the benefits system was long overdue for reform. It's far too complicated, and the principle of a single benefit, albeit, with the difficulties of engaging electronically, most people would welcome, most people would agree with the principle that we should be encouraging people where they can work, that that's the best place for them to be. And I think it's unfortunate the bedroom tax has completely detracted attention from all of that, and goodness knows universal credit has its own difficulties. So the principle overall, most housing professionals, I think, would have agreed with, but this has certainly completely blown us off course in terms of trying to get a more rational, effective benefit system in place.
Mr. Bookbinder.
If you take a narrow view of what the bedroom tax has saved the Treasury, then you may well find that it's saved pretty much what they thought would be saved. That the Treasury's estimates of the savings from this mechanism were based on the premise that around about 85% of tenants, or at least 85% of tenants, would not move from their home. That's been borne out, as this committee is well aware of. There isn't the stock to have enabled more than 10 or 15% of tenants to move. So purely looking at what it saved the Treasury, notwithstanding some people moving into more expensive private rented accommodation, but the scale of that, I think, has been relatively modest. It will have saved the Treasury, but of course the indirect costs,
but not the public purse,
but not the public, not the wider public purse at all, because of the sort of costs that we've been hearing about that councils and housing associations.
So cost shunting that's making the poor poorer. Yeah. Thank you, gentlemen. Thank you, convener.
Annabelle.
Thank you, convener. Good morning, good afternoon, gentlemen. Just very briefly, I think we've covered really quite a lot of the ground that needed to be covered. But looking at the written submission in particular of the Chartered Institute of Housing, and I do accept that it was dated December, and obviously we're in a very fluid situation. But I note that the conclusion was that It was felt by CIH that Scotland that there was considerable uncertainty around what the petition was calling for, and therefore CIH was not really in a position to go into great detail about its position in light of the perceived uncertainty in taking into account inter alia what exactly is the amount being called for. Also, is that going to mean then that tenants who have managed to pay, albeit presumably for most of them it's been a huge struggle to pay, but they have not required DHP assistance, are they to be reimbursed, or the mechanisms and so forth and so forth? I just wonder, now that we've had the opportunity of at least an initial discussion this morning, what particularly Mr Bookbinder's view would be now in light of the discussion. Is it still his position on behalf of CIH Scotland that there is still considerable uncertainty about exactly what the petition is calling for, and therefore that he is not able to commit to a particular position on it as yet?
Every month that goes by, we feel a little, we feel a little bit clearer about what the position is. That the Scottish Government's own figures recently announced on what DHP spend has incurred so far. That all these things help fill the picture. What I would say is that I think what we can be clear on is that when you're talking about help to mitigate the impact, the issue you've identified of what about the people that have paid and probably paid at some cost to when they could have spent the money on something else is a very significant issue, because to find a way, for instance, of recompensing those tenants in arrears, whereas other tenants who may have gone without other things and are not in arrears, it seems incredibly iniquitous.
I think we've exhausted questions, so can I thank you again for helping us to understand and consider the issues that have been brought before us by witnesses who are seeking to have addressed the problems that are being caused by welfare reform. No doubt we'll call on your expertise again at some point in the future, and I appreciate the time that you're taking to assist us in our work. Thank you very much. Okay, we still have an agenda item in private to deal with. It's our actual interim bedroom tax report, so we have to go back into private session. Thank you.